This is kind of crazy. The tenacious Southerner was turned out of office by disillusioned voters after a single term, but he had a brilliant post-presidential career as a champion of health, peace, and democracy. That is crazy. This was on your list of predictions? Yes. We're live. We're alive. And I hope... Oops. Sorry. Chill, dog. Wait, what? Oh my God. There ain't no f***ing... Dude. Wait, let's see. Oh my God. As of 4 minutes ago, according to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, former President Jimmy Carter died at the young age of 100. Dog, he was 100. Stop acting like you're Nostradamus. I'm not acting like I'm Nostradamus at all. However, I did say approximately 4 days ago that one of my predictions for 2024 was that Jimmy Carter would pass, and many chatters made fun of me, and I told them, look, there are still a couple days before the year ends. That's the only reason why I'm confused by this. Not because, you know, it is a Mickey Mouse prediction. That is actually wild. That is kind of wild. And the obits are coming out. And of course, this means we got to have the #1 Carter hater, Felix Biederman, on the broadcast to talk about this. But like, this is kind of crazy. The tenacious Southerner was turned out of office by disillusioned voters after a single term, but he had a brilliant post-presidential career as a champion of health, peace, and democracy. That is crazy. This was on your list of predictions? Yes. But it's not surprising that this was on my list of predictions. What is surprising is that while this was on my list of predictions, it is a Mickey Mouse one. It is a gimme. It seemed like it was not going to happen. The other two on the list were Bill Clinton and Mitch McConnell. And not only did I thought I got it wrong. I thought he was going to keep it going until 2025. And in the eve of the turn of this year, Bill Clinton went into the hospital, but it was a fever for a flu, and it wasn't that significant. You predict that a man in hospice was going to die and gave a year span to get it right? Okay, first of all, I'm not saying this is a crazy prediction. I think what makes it crazy is that what's crazy is that like it did not happen, and then 4 days ago or whatever, I said like there's still time in this year. Dude, that's a buzzer beater. Like, I'm sorry. That's what makes this unique. Like, nobody thought he was going to live forever. Okay, calm down. Now, of course, Jimmy Carter is a really interesting figure because he has done a lot of personal good. And a lot of Republicans hate him and historically have considered him like the worst president, seeing him as like a beacon of being a pussy pinko commie, right? What's interesting, however, is that Jimmy Carter, throughout his reign, as every American president, was responsible for a tremendous amount of death and destruction and violence all around the world. And maybe even domestically, he was the leading figure in the neoliberal changes that occurred within Democratic leadership, marking an attitude shift in the way that the modern Democratic Party that you absolutely despise operated. So it is many people that are more knowledgeable than myself will talk about how he was the original neoliberal president. He's not even in his grave yet, so that he can turn in it at this criticism. Okay, first of all, how did he die? The plane crash? No, I think he died because he was at the end of his life, dude. He was at 1 HP for quite a long time. So tomorrow, I think I will probably do a deeper dive into Jimmy Carter to get you to understand the full scope of things. It is one of those unique moments where, like, I do think that even a person who is an otherwise good individual in the helm of power, especially when they are sitting on the throne of empire, American empire, can do a metric ton of evil. Because I do think Jimmy Carter is not a bad person. I think as far as like American presidents goes, like individually, I don't think he is as like openly evil. But given the role that he took on, he did a whole bunch of evil shit. He died because he couldn't handle Kamala's loss. He was supposed to get a cabinet position. Yeah. He was a war criminal like every single one of them after FDR. I mean, yeah. That's hard to disagree. Fuck him. No, as a person, as an individual, I think Jimmy Carter was a pretty good person. Like, he's not like fucking George W. Bush, like, where the humanizing component of George W. Bush is that he paints like he paints the dead Iraqi children that he's responsible for killing. Okay, you're absolutely wrong about this. Come on, dude. Anyway, Jimmy Carter was alive for both the rise and fall of Nazi Germany. Okay, he saw the moon landing. He was alive for the invention of the toast, like the sliced bread. He was alive for the invention of the state of Israel. And perhaps most importantly, Jimmy Carter was alive for Haktua. And I suspect he was also very taken aback by Haley Welch, also known as Haktua Girl, pulling a rug pull on many Americans, including Jimmy Carter. Perhaps this contributed to his untimely demise at the age of 100. The Haktua coin rug pull probably played a formative role in his untimely demise. How much money do I think Jimmy C had in Haktua coin? A lot. Far too much. From the invention of flight at Kitty Hawk to the collapse of Haktua, Jimmy Carter saw it all. Is it fucked up if I say Jimmy Carter saw the rise and fall of Adolf Hitler and perhaps more notably Haktua? I mean, it's a joke. But you know, we all know how the internet takes the joke. I did it. I posted it. If heaven is real, Jimmy's farming peanuts for Jesus. I don't know if any American president goes to heaven, chatter. If there is a heaven and hell, I don't think any American president is going to heaven. There is not enough atonement that you can engage in personally. I think that debt will be paid. And yes, not even Carter, who did engage in a shit ton of good. Absolutely. In his individual life, Jimmy Carter was an exemplary individual. That much is 100% true. I will never sit here and act like that's not the case. That's why I'm saying he's one of the very unique. He is a unique president in the sense that out of all of like the modern age American presidents, he is the one notable figure that comes to mind that actively, in a very hands-on approach, did good things. Okay? He did. Having said that, however, Ashtam, I'm not from the USA. Can you explain what good things he did? Habitat for Humanity, like actively built houses on his own, did a shit ton, set up global NGOs that still actively monitor to this day, like foreign policy initiatives from a much more sensible perspective, regardless of what he had done when he was in office. Hold on. He came here to little old Winnipeg, Manitoba to build houses. That man was all the fuck over putting up homes. A man should not be alive for Vladimir Lenin's death and Skibbity Toilet. Yeah. Jimmy Carter's last tweet. I'm all in on Haktua coin. Hold on that thing. Why are you calling him a good guy? He committed genocide in East Timor. Chatter, I think you misunderstood what I was saying. I was saying that I think it's important to note that he was a good person individually and still is, I mentioned over and over again that he's probably looking up at us if there is a fucking heaven and hell, okay? You understand? Like, worse fucking timing. Some chatters need transcripts to reference because their ears do not work. Yeah. I think it's also really interesting because, like, you can be the best person possible in your individual affairs and yet still do a metric ton of objectively evil things in, when you are sitting on the throne. Hasan, your chat is so racist. Okay. Jimmy Carter, a no-frills and steel-willed Southern governor who was elected president in 1976, was rejected by disillusioned voters after a single term and went on to extraordinary post-presidential life that included winning the Nobel Peace Prize, died Sunday at his home in Plains, Georgia, according to his son, James E. Carter, known as Chip. He was 100 and the oldest living U.S. president at the time, of all time. His son confirmed the death, but did not provide an immediate cause. I mean, we can make up our minds on this. I think you just kind of die at that point. As you know, He was literally living on 1 HP for quite some time. Okay. In February 2023, in a statement, the Carter Center said the former president, after a series of hospital stays, will stop further medical treatment and spend his remaining time at home under hospice care. He had been treated in recent years for an aggressive form of melanoma skin cancer with tumors that spread to his liver and brain. His wife, Rosalind, died on November 19th, 2023 at 96. Okay. The Carters, who were close partners in public life, had been married for more than 77 years, the longest presidential marriage in U.S. history. His final public appearance was at her funeral in Plains, where he sat in the front row in a wheelchair. Mr. Carter, a small-town peanut farmer, U.S. Navy veteran, and Georgia governor from 1971 to 1975, was the first president from the Deep South since 1837, and the only Democrat elected president between Lyndon B. Johnson's and Bill Clinton's terms in the White House. As the nation's 39th president, he governed with strong Democratic majorities in Congress, but in a country that was growing more conservative. 4 years after taking office, Mr. Carter lost his bid for re-election in a landslide to one of the most conservative political figures in the era, Ronald Reagan. When Mr. Carter left Washington in January 1981, he was widely regarded as a mediocre president, if not an outright failure. The list of what had gone wrong during his presidency, not all of it his fault, was long. It was a time of economic distress with stagnant economy and stubbornly high unemployment and inflation. Stagflation, connoting both low growth and high inflation, was a description that critics used to attack Mr. Carter's economic policies. In the summer of 1979, Americans waited in long lines of service stations as gasoline supplies dwindled and prices soared after the revolution in Iran disrupted the global oil supply.
Carter.
So Noam Chomsky, this is a very famous Noam Chomsky bit where he just like in the shortest terms, he just like goes over some of the war crimes of every single president. For those of you who are confused about like what Carter has done, this is just foreign policy. We haven't even talked about like domestic policy and how some of the initiatives laid forth by the Carter administration basically supercharged or at least provided reasonable ground for the Reagan administration to come in and turn America into the shithole that you know and love. So
Carter increased as the Indonesian atrocities were increasing. They peaked in 1978. Carter's flow of weapons to Indonesia increased when Congress imposed human rights restrictions. By then there was a human rights movement in Congress to block the flow of advanced weaponry to Indonesia. Carter arranged through Mondale, vice president, to get Israel to send U.S. Skyhawks to Indonesia to enable Indonesia to complete what turned out to be near genocide, killing maybe a quarter of the population or something. In the Middle East, Carter just won the Nobel Prize. His great achievement was the Camp David agreements.
yeah,
The Camp David agreements are presented as a diplomatic triumph for the United States. In fact, they were a diplomatic catastrophe. At Camp David, the United States and Israel accepted, finally, Egypt's 1971 offer, which they had then, U.S. had rejected at the time, except that now it was...
Can you explain Ronald Reagan administration like I'm five? Sure. Everything that you despise about like, as a consumer, everything that you despise about like, I don't know, shittier and shittier versions of the same products that you get, all the way from that to broad sweeping anti-labor initiatives that were implemented and continue to this day can be traced back to Ronald Reagan, Reaganomics, trickle-down economics, virtually everything that sucks in the United States of America. I'm not in favor of like a single person being responsible for all of the evil. Obviously, that is anti-materialist thinking. Having said that, however, in the most reductive terms, if you hate something that's happening and you're like, why does the government have no solution to this? It seems like other competent administrations actually have a solution to this. Why is there so much income inequality? Why is there so much death and destruction? You can trace all of that back to Ronald Reagan. He is the guy, and he is so bad that you can even point to Carter opening up the opportunity for this evil spawn of Satan to take control over by incredible margins the American government virtually destroy everything about American life.
Worse from the U.S.-Israeli point of view because it included the Palestinians. In order to get Israel to accept Egypt's 1971 offer after a major war and atrocities and so on, Carter raised military and other aid to Israel to more than 50% of total aid worldwide. Israel used it once in exactly the way they said.
It is okay not to blame Dems every 5 seconds. What are you talking about? I mean, I'm literally talking about how everything bad in American modernity is Ronald Reagan's responsibility. But if you're talking about like anti-union initiatives and the proto-neoliberal attitudes demonstrated by American governments, yes, Carter played a role in this. That is correct.
Said they were going to do, as every sane person knew, as an opportunity to attack their northern neighbor, first in 1978, then in 1982, and to increase integration of the occupied territories. And that's for starters. We can continue.
Reagan?
I don't think we have to talk about that one either. I mean, Reagan is the first president to have been condemned by the International Court of Justice for what they called the unlawful use of force, meaning international terrorism in the war against Nicaragua. Again, that's just for starters. They also, the Security Council endorsed it in 2 resolutions, both of which were vetoed by the United States.
Bush won.
Well,
I don't agree that all presidents are in hell. What about the guy who did the checker speech? He seems pretty wholesome. What? So Jimmy Carter, regardless on the initial opinions on Israel Palestine or what he did, once again, I must repeat my original position that like post presidency he had a lot of prescient takes on Israel.
Apartheid is
this is one of them.
Is exactly accurate. You know,
here he is on Democracy Now in 2007 talking about the utilization of the term apartheid when describing Israel.
The word apartheid is exactly accurate. You know, this is an area that's occupied by 2 powers. They're now completely separated. The Palestinians can't even ride on the same roads that the Israelis have created or built in Palestinian territory. The Israelis never see a Palestinian except their Israeli soldiers. The Palestinians never see an Israeli except at a distance, except the Israeli soldiers. So within Palestinian territory, they're absolutely and totally separated, much worse than they were in South Africa, by the way. And the other thing is, the other definition of apartheid is one side dominates the other, and the Israelis completely dominate the life of the Palestinian people.
Why don't Americans know what you have seen?
Americans don't want to know, and many Israelis don't want to know what is going on inside Palestine. It's a terrible human rights persecution.
I know that this is a joke, but there's nothing funnier than looking at a guy like Jimmy Carter who was 100 fucking years old and was basically dying in hospice care for the past year and thinking, oh, I wonder if there's like, it seems kind of weird. Was he vaccinated? Seems kind of weird. Maybe Mossad killed him. It's like there's perhaps not a better example of looking at a very open and shut case, looking at a story that does not require any sort of magical thinking whatsoever, and still trying to hammer in a mystical, magical narrative, a grand conspiracy. It is fucking fantastic.
That is far transcends what any outsider would imagine.
Jimmy Carter's conditions were, so dire that I feel like if someone killed him, you would consider it like, active voluntary euthanasia at this point. It's just like no one would be like, we got to litigate this.
And there are powerful political forces in America that prevents any objective analysis of the problem in the Holy Land. I think it's accurate to say that not a single member of Congress with whom I'm familiar would possibly speak out and call for Israel to withdraw to their legal boundaries. or to publicize the plight of the Palestinians, or even to call publicly and repeatedly for good faith peace talks. There hadn't been a day of peace talks now in more than 7 years. So this is a taboo subject, and I would say that if any member of Congress did speak out, as I've just described, they would probably not be back into Congress the next term.
Oh my God, that's so loud. Holy fuck. Does Mossad know where RFK Jr. lives? Brother, RFK Jr. is unimaginably pro-Israel. It wasn't just him. Even his Secretary of State, who was Mika Brzezinski's father, is known for being outspoken on Palestine. Yes. I mean, but this isn't even like him being outspoken in a pro-Palestinian way. He's just like literally relitigating the falsehoods that Joe Scarborough was presenting. Okay, the falsehoods that Joe Scarborough is presenting here are the inaccuracies are just, you know, he's just fact checking him in real time. Ironically enough, he would then later become Joe Scarborough's father-in-law. But you know, this is Free Taiwan testing something. Okay. Now, Zbigniew Brzezinski is one of the leading figures in the Vietnamization of Afghanistan. Just saying. So if you want to tie that back to like 9/11, for example, you want to tie Carter back to 9/11, there's opportunity for you to do so as well. Something that I've talked about quite a bit. A lot of people will point to Ronald Reagan, but it goes back. It's actually, you have to, you know, dive a little bit further. Why all you care about is 9/11 and working out? Yeah, here is Jimmy Carter's #1 hater in the United States of America, Felix Biederman, who has apparently heard of the news. Iconic Jimmy Carter moments: Uberizing international warfare, abandoning New Deal policies in favor of a deregulatory race to the bottom, inviting Lash to the White House and pleading, "Please tell me what to do," and Lash going, "I don't know, just give up." Why you wear so many necklaces? What? Mr. Carter made energy his signature domestic policy initiative, and he had some success, but events outside of his control intervened. In March 1979, in a unit of the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, suffered a core meltdown. The accident was the worst event for U.S. nuclear energy industry and a severe setback of hopes that nuclear power would provide a safe alternative to oil and other fossil fuels. Mr. Carter's fortunes were no better overseas. In November 1979, an Iranian mob seized control of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking 52 Americans as hostages. It was the beginning of a 444-day ordeal that played out on daily on television and did not end until January 20th, 1981, the day Mr. Carter left office, when the hostages were released. Now, what's really interesting about that process is that, you know, that was another... Remember when I talked about fucking Donald Trump cutting a side deal with Benjamin Netanyahu? Yeah. No, it's just sauces, Mom. All right, let's see what fucking CNN is saying.
Still getting these drips and drabs from Jimmy Carter's family or those around him about how he was doing. We knew that he wanted to make it through the election. We had gotten that reporting, but we had still been sort of hearing from those around him in the last year or so, even though he was in hospice care.
Yeah, and I was always checking in to see how he was doing with his friends and his family, and I would get updates, and I was always pretty much encouraged. Even though he was in hospice for the past year, he was still enjoying and watching sports, and I was enjoying and watching sports, but he was a big Atlanta Braves fan, baseball fan, was watching games with his kids and his grandkids and his family and friends. So I would always get relatively upbeat assessments on how he was doing over the past year. But everybody knew under hospice, it was only a matter of time, and 100 years old. You know, that's a
damn,
very,
Wolf,
very
chill.
long life that he led. So we all anticipated it was only a matter of time, and now it has happened. And I think I speak for so many of our viewers in the United States and around the world when I say I want to express our deepest condolences to his loving family. May he rest in peace, and as we say, may his memory be a blessing.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, his family, I think it was his grandson, Wolf, that we saw at the DNC over the summer, as you point out, as we sort of had gotten these, you know, these stories from those around him. Wolf, we appreciate you being here. Stand by for a moment if you can. I want to now bring into the conversation President Carter biographer Kai Bird. Kai, do I have you?
Yes.
Yeah, just top line reaction. You know, as Wolf was just saying, you know, the former president was in hospice care. He had recently celebrated his 100th birthday. It is still nonetheless really shocking news.
Well, it is a long life, over 100 years.
Yeah, I don't really care. Like, I don't feel bad when a 100-year-old dies. Like, I don't know. I mean, they did it. They maxed out. I would
argue, as the biographer who spent 6 years working on his life,
I don't know if I'm weird about this at all, but it's like, dude, if you live to 100 and you died around your fucking loved ones, it's like, what? You did it. You won. Like, what are we fucking doing here? You know, you made it. You maxed out. That's the fucking hard cap. That is the hard level cap on life. Okay. There is a finite amount of time that you could be alive. You make it past like 80, you're great. You're chilling. Okay. Big time. Does that make sense? Like, I don't know. Maybe I sometimes come across as like indifferent when I'm covering stuff like this, but it's like, I don't know. Maybe it's weird for me to not feel some type of way about this. Maybe I'm supposed to feel bad, but I can't. You know, he lived a long ass life. He got to do a whole bunch of shit. A lot of bad as well, considering that he was, you know, once again, the president of the United States of America. It just comes with the job, comes with the territory. Anti-union initiatives, you know, creating the groundwork for Ronald Reagan and neoliberalism, but from the Democratic Party side in terms of domestic affairs. But then also when it comes to foreign policy, continuing American death and destruction, continuing American empire. What good did he do? I mean, he built houses and shit. Like, he's like a nice person overall, and has been a longtime advocate for Palestinian emancipation. There's a lot of stuff that he's done post-presidency. I wrote a book about it.
Your 21st book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. Let me read from page 215 of your book. A system of apartheid with two peoples occupying the same land but completely separated from each other.
Like, his org, the Carter Foundation, is like one of the few shockingly, I would say, reasonable American foreign policy institutes out there. Having said that, of course, he, once again, controlled the reins of American empire. So he still did a lot of, you know, metric ton of evil too.
With Israelis totally dominant and suppressing violence by depriving Palestinians of their basic human rights. This is the policy now being followed. And last Sunday, you told the Louisville Journal, I would say that in many ways the treatment of the Palestinians by the Israeli occupying forces is as onerous, and in some cases more onerous, as the treatment of black people in South Africa by the apartheid government. Those are very strong words.
They're exactly accurate. And I think I should point out quickly that the book refers to Palestine and not to Israel. And I also make clear in the book that the apartheid that is perpetrated now on the Palestinians in the occupied territories is not based on racism. It's based on the desire by a minority of Israelis for Palestinian land. And in the acquisition of that land, the occupation, the confiscation, and then the colonization of that land, they are perpetuating an absolute and total division.
Another woke college
between
kid.
Israelis living on Palestinian territory.
These young
and the
woke
right
college students,
to interrelate with any Israelis who are occupying their own land. So that word is accurate for what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians on Palestinian territory. The Arabs that live in the occupied territories, which is not Israel's territory, but their own, are horribly abused. And I don't think anyone could go to the West Bank and Gaza or even to East Jerusalem and see what's happening now to the Palestinians that would disagree with my use of the word apartheid.
As I read your book, this struck me, particularly from someone in political life. You wrote the following: there are constant and vehement political and media debates in Israel concerning its policies in the West Bank, but because of powerful political, economic, and religious forces in the United States, Israeli government decisions are rarely questioned or condemned. Voices from Jerusalem dominate in our media, and most American citizens are unaware of circumstances in the occupied territories. And then you went on to say, there's no doubt there is a strong aversion to criticizing Israel in this country. I wouldn't say it's all because of intimidation, but that is one factor.
Yes. Do you disagree with that? Well, I won't ask you that. You're the one asking questions. But I don't think anyone could disagree with that. There are very few, if any, voices in the political realm of Washington.
Do you understand why I'm saying it's complicated and I'm not like immediately running the classic, like, he's a ginormous piece of shit line? This is part of the reason.
Or in the major news media, who would raise the kind of issues that are raised in this book.
Why?
I
have said in the book. I don't know if it's intimidation or just reticence. There are some factors that are involved even in the religious circles, but it's completely, almost completely unacceptable in this country for any public official to criticize the policies of Israel, even if they are horribly abusive against the Palestinians and violate human rights.
This is, in effect, taking on the, quote, Israeli lobby or the Jewish lobby.
That's part, the Jewish lobby may be part of it. I didn't say that in the book, but I think that's part of it. But even, you know, I don't think that the Washington Post or the New York Times or NBC or others are intimidated by the Jewish lobby. But I think there's a reticence, even in public fora, to describe both sides of the issues in the West Bank.
What the fuck? I fap 4 times a day?
Unity to act as the indispensable mediator.
Almost never in our history has a president devoted so much time on a single problem.
He had studied
to the 46th president of the United States,
who deeply mistrusted each other. He wrote Sadat and Begin personal letters inviting them to Camp David. And when they arrived on American soil, it was high stakes for all 3 men involved.
Failure here would just increase the impression that Mr. Carter is a nice man, but an inept president.
This meeting is truly historic, and the people who will participate know it.
13 days of intense negotiations, crucially behind closed doors. No leaks, no social media, no media at all.
The Israeli delegation is totally zipped up. Even less is coming out of it than is coming out of the Egyptian delegation.
At Camp David, Carter and his team shuttle back and forth between the 2 men and their teams, often negotiating late into the night. Carter's national security advisor, the late Zbigniew Brzezinski, described what looked like mission impossible.
Sadat, to sign a peace treaty with Begin, had to break ranks with the entire Arab world. He had to face isolation. Begin, to agree with Sadat, had to give up territory for the first time and to give up settlements.
When direct talks between Sadat and Begin became too heated, Carter kept them apart and quashed any attempt to call off the negotiations. After 2 weeks of complications, drama, and false starts, the men finally returned to Washington to deliver the good news. They had reached a deal.
Just look at 2 weeks ago what the situation was. Peace process all but dead.
An achievement none thought possible.
It appears that the president won, and he won big.
Decades after Camp David, I sat down with President Carter and asked him how in the world he had done it.
There you were, you brought peace with Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat. It all seems so much easier then, was it? Or is that just what we think now, all these years later?
I think it was much more difficult because I was negotiating between 2 men whose nations had been at war 4 times in just 25 years.
The magnitude of that accomplishment lives on in the image of that 3-way handshake. The Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin summed it up like this.
The Camp David Conference should be renamed. It was the Jimmy Carter Conference.
The final result? Israel would return the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, a piece of land the 2 had fought wars over. Egypt would finally recognize Israel's right to exist and give Israel access to the crucial Suez Canal shipping lanes. Both leaders declared no more fighting. All 3 men would eventually be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. But one thing wouldn't change. Arabs called Sadat a traitor. 3 years later, he was assassinated by Muslim extremists in his own country. Still, many years later, President Carter told me that he was proud of this first peace deal between Arabs and Israelis.
The peace treaty that was negotiated between Israel and Egypt over extremely difficult circumstances was beneficial to both sides, and not a single word of the treaty has been violated. It was much more difficult than the altercation between the Israelis and the Palestinians is today.
And that conflict, the one between Palestinians and Israelis, still rages on to this day. But it doesn't alter the fact that there was a shining moment when Jimmy Carter engaged the full and indispensable role of the United States and changed one corner of the Middle East forever. Christiana Manpour, CNN, London.
All right, let's now bring in CNN Chief National Affairs Correspondent Jeff Zeleny. Jeff, good to have you. I want to follow up on something that we heard a short time ago from President Carter's biographer, Kai Bird. He said, in a lot of ways, President Carter was ahead of his times in many ways, particularly in foreign affairs.
Rahel, there is no question that he was ahead of his time in so many ways as an environmentalist, as a conservationist, and as we are really getting the reactions from Democrats and Republicans, American leaders. I'm looking at one now from former President Bill Clinton and Secretary Hillary Clinton. They talk about how they met him in 1975. They're praising his really post-presidency work. Also getting reaction from Republican Senator Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, praising his post-presidency work. The through line to this here is that Jimmy Carter believed that a president's afterlife, a post-presidency, should not be a time to make profit, but actually a time to do good. And that, of course, is something that is really the last of his kind in that respect. He was not known to give big speeches leaving office, but let's talk about him being in office for a moment. You're right, he was ahead of his time. There's no question his protecting the lands of Alaska, his work on the Panama Canal, and even putting solar panels on the White House. And I was just actually watching a documentary over the weekend called Carterland, which is such a good encapsulation of his time in office. And he was talking about in the year 2000, of course, that seemed like a long time away in the 70s, but talking about the solar panels on the White House. Of course, Ronald Reagan had them removed when he came into office. But when you look at his classic American story, he definitely was elected at 52 years old, but ahead of his time in so many ways.
Yeah, I just want to read a comment that we're getting in from the former president's son, Jeff. I'll read it out for you. It says, "My father was a hero, not only to me, but to everyone who believes in peace, human rights, and unselfish love." This is coming from Chip Carter. He continued and said, "My brothers, sister, and I shared with him with the rest of the world through these common beliefs. The world is our family because of the way he brought people together, and we thank you for honoring his memory by continuing to live these shared beliefs." You know, Jeff, in a lot of ways, he was sort of in a class of his own. I mean, he was the oldest living former president. You know, he lived to 100. He, you know, as we just said, he was a president sort of ahead of his time. But talk to us a little bit about sort of how he, even just in terms of how he sort of had this second career after leaving office that in and of itself was remarkable.
Well, it absolutely was. I mean, he, you know, was elected as a fresh face of the South in the wake of Watergate and in the anger from Vietnam. If we think of every presidential election as a series of, you know, a linked chain of events, his was a reaction to the Nixon administration and the Ford presidency and the anger in the country over President Ford pardoning Richard Nixon. So he was the agent of change at that point. But of course, the economy and so many other things got in the way. And his advisors at the time said, "You're doing too much."
Yes, this was in my predictions for 2024.
Perhaps some of this for the second term. Of course, there was no second term. Ronald Reagan handily defeated him. But I think going back to Jimmy Carter, he had if you look through these documentaries and if you walk through the Carter Center in Atlanta, as I have several times, the pictures in the Oval Office as the buck stops here. Of course, that's the Harry Truman line, but also it's something that he took to heart. And as we are looking here at statements still coming in, an interesting line here from Senator Mitch McConnell. He said, "President Carter served during times of tension and uncertainty, both at home and abroad, but his calm spirit and deep faith seemed unshakable." And faith, I think, Rahel, is something that is central to Jimmy Carter's life. Of course, we remember seeing him at the funeral of his wife of 77 years, Rosalind, just a little over a year ago. And now he has taken his lead, reunited with her. So an American love story, an American original in so many ways, will be celebrated over the next several days as his funeral plans begin to take shape.
Yeah, you know, Jeff, that's a really important point. It's something that we hadn't touched on yet, but just his faith and sort of how crucial that was and the way that he lived his life. Jeff, thank you. I want to now bring in for a moment Kai Bird, who was with us now. Kai, I mean, you have had the privilege of you know, working with Jimmy Carter quite closely. Give us a sense, if you might, of some personal anecdotes or any stories that really stood out to you.
Well, you were speaking about Camp David and his intervention to achieve a peace treaty in the Middle East, you know, he took on this issue with no background in it. He
was just that good.
His advisors all told him not to do it, that it was dangerous territory. And yet Carter, you know, was a very well-read man, and he thought he was the most intelligent guy in the room, and he could educate himself on this issue. And he just decided, this is something that is really important to do, and I'm going to use my powers of the presidency to make something happen where no one else has been able to go to that territory. And over the objections of Zbigniew Brzezinski, his national security advisor, he organized this Camp David retreat and invited Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin. And over 13 days, it was an incredible drama of personal diplomacy in which he forced them to stay there. They both tried to leave on at least 2 occasions. And he managed to keep them there for 13 days and iron out an agreement. And at a sort of critical tipping point, just as Menachem Begin was about to storm out once again, Carter came over to Menachem Begin's cabin in Camp David and brought with him photographs of himself and Begin and Sadat. And he had signed to his grandchildren, to Begin's grandchildren. And he had gotten their names, and he handed these little gifts. And this caused the very stern and staid Begin to break down and start weeping because Carter had inscribed them, you know, for peace for our grandchildren. And this was sort of brought home to Begin that he was missing an opportunity. And at that point, he said, okay, I'll go back. I'll negotiate one more round with you. And out of that came the Camp David Accords, which are still in effect. They brought peace between Egypt and Israel. And yet there was a missed opportunity because Carter always believed that he also got the outlines for a peace between Israel and the Palestinians as well. And that, of course, is a very controversial argument that historians are still trying to figure out all these decades later.
Yeah. Kai, I want to ask you to weigh in on something my colleague Jeff Zeleny had just mentioned there toward the end of our conversation, but the importance of Jimmy Carter's faith and the way in which he pursued his work and the way in which he pursued the issues and the causes that were important to him.
Yes, faith mattered a great deal to him. He was a Southern Baptist. He thought of Israel and Palestine as the Holy Land. And he just thought it was a tragedy that war was being fought in the Holy Land. And he believed that he had studied the issue enough to understand what a compromise might look like.
Nope.
2 states for 2 peoples, and territorial compromises, and sharing of Jerusalem. And all of that was sort of set in the background of the Camp David Accords.
I thought he famously didn't know shit. Like, he didn't know anything, with the exception of, like, maybe some biblical text. And also, Camp David Accords unironically solidified Israel's position of dominance over the Palestinians.
You know, we're seeing, it's ironic, but, you know, Jimmy Carter was dealing with Israel, Palestine, Iran, revolutionary Iran, the same issues we're dealing with today. But if he had gotten an agreement from Begin in 1978 to freeze the settlements in the West Bank, no more building of settlements in the West Bank for 5 years, that would have been a huge step. That would have led, inevitably, I would argue, to a 2-state solution. And here we are decades later, and Jimmy Carter always believed that this was his biggest failure in the presidency, that he didn't somehow get that pinned down.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point, Kai. I mean, what do you make of some of the parallels between his time in office and sort of present day 2024, whether we're talking about Iran, whether we're talking about the conflict in the Middle East? And you mentioned Paul Volcker earlier, the Federal Reserve Chair, who was, you know, in charge of fighting the highest inflation that we had seen in years, and we have seen since then. And so it is just sort of remarkable, the parallels between his time in office and 2024.
Yeah, this is why Carter's presidency, not just his ex-presidency, but his presidency is so relevant to us today, because he was grappling with these extremely difficult issues that he took on head-on, including energy, race, religion, climate change, as we've discussed, peace in the Middle East, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
How long ago do you think they had this video ready to go? Years. People start writing obituaries so early on. Famously, Henry Kissinger had co-writers on his New York Times obituary. Some of the people who co-wrote Henry Kissinger's obituary died before Henry Kissinger died.
A solution in Israel-Palestine, or race, or the separation of religion and state, which is something that Carter, Southern Baptist, was very much committed to. So his presidency is oddly relevant in a way that I think most Americans don't understand or have forgotten.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. Kai Bird, we so appreciate you being with us on this breaking news. Again, former President Jimmy Carter has died at the age of 100. And thank you for joining me today. We're going to continue to cover this breaking news. Omar Jimenez picks up now.
This is CNN Breaking News.
We begin this hour with breaking news. Former President Jimmy Carter has died at the age of 100. The Carter Center says the 39th president died this afternoon, surrounded by family in his hometown of Plains, Georgia. The former president had been in home hospice care since February of 2023, but Carter became the oldest living former president when he surpassed the record held by the late George H.W. Bush in March of 2019. Carter, a Georgia peanut farmer and a lifelong Democrat, served a single term as president from 1977 to 1981, losing a re-election bid to Ronald Reagan. Now, his presidency was defined by blows to America's economy and conflicts overseas, but his most enduring legacy came after his presidency, winning a Nobel Peace Prize and redefining himself as a human rights pioneer. Joining us now, CNN's Jake Tapper takes a look at how former President Carter spent his long life embracing faith and how it shaped his life and career.